City of Stevens Point Housing Task Force meeting, recorded May 24, 2022.
We're good to go?
All right, well, with that, we do have quorum now in 3:16. Thanks everyone for coming out today on Tuesday and being flexible. And to Director Konoski for putting together our discussion today. Do you want to do a roll call? You've
Nope.
got the names, great.
Yep, we got the names.
All right, the first thing that we got a PowerPoint in our email about today, but also we're going to be discussing here is the definition of family.
Okay, so let me just pull this up here. Essentially, one of the topics that has been come up a number of times with the Housing Task Force is how do you define family? Currently within our zoning code, it's essentially a family unit plus one, which equates to no more than two unrelated individuals. So you could have, a husband-wife plus one roommate, essentially, because they would be married plus one. So, and that's how city staff has interpreted it for a number of years. That's how it's technically written. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, just remember that this is a policy recommendation body. It's not necessarily we'll put together recommendations, provide it to the Plan Commission, provide it to the Common Council for their final consideration. But this is really where I think we're going to be able to kind of have some of these more intense conversations about what the definition of family could be or should be within the City of Stevens Point zoning code. As I mentioned, our current code more or less says family is an individual or two or more persons related by blood, marriage, adoption, foster arrangement, or similar legal relationship, and functioning as a single housekeeping entity, or such individual or person plus one individual not having such a similar legal relationship, but functioning as a part of the single housekeeping entity. And then it does not apply to the tourist rooming house, which is Airbnb, VRBO. So you can essentially read that as family plus one. And that was, and here are a couple of examples that I put together. Wasn't too creative with my naming, but Larry and Anna, they're a couple, not married or together by legal relationship. That is the legal definition of family under code because you have two unrelated individuals residing in the same dwelling. Let's say Larry and Anna decide to get married, and they invite Mary to rent from them. That would technically be legal because it's two people who are related plus one who is not related by any of the definitions or means that we had mentioned earlier. So I put these out here. The other one would probably be that kind of sticks out as, for whatever reason, it's been more of an issue probably the last few years than others, but let's say Anna's a student at UW Stevens Point. She decides to purchase a home when she goes to college, or her parents decide to purchase her a home before she goes to college to live there for her 3, 4, 5 years, and she decides to rent 3 of the rooms to friends. If the house was not previously utilized as a boarding house, that would technically be illegal under our current code. We had something very similar situation on Reserve Street this past winter where that's exactly what happened. We had a student that purchased a single family home for his time in college, rented out the other 3 rooms to friends, and unfortunately we had to send him a not so friendly letter reminding him that he's outside of the purview of the zoning code. Again, no more than 2 unrelated individuals can reside at the same residence, and yes, Stevens Point is probably the most restrictive definition of family in the state of Wisconsin. Adam had done a lot of good research, which was not included as part of this PowerPoint, but into what other communities do. Additionally, the 2017 housing study had a fairly comprehensive list of what other university towns in the state have as well, including Eau Claire, La Crosse, Platteville. I think those are the 3, maybe Whitewater as well. Okay, just keep going then. We get the classic why, how. So essentially, from what city staff can understand, the current zoning code that we work under was adopted in 1979. And part of the reason the definition of family is put in there was during the 70s, there was an exceptional increase in student population at UW Stevens Point, and we saw a number of the homes within the core of the city becoming boarding houses for the university. And so when the new code was adopted, the definition of family was adopted, and those boarding homes were grandfathered in or legal nonconforming. And that's why those still exist as they are today. They were boarding houses prior to the 1979 adoption of the definition of family, and because when you adopt a new zoning ordinance after an existing use has already been utilized, you can't go in and retroactively say you can't do that anymore. The state doesn't allow municipalities to do that. We have to grandfather them, or the more politically correct is legal nonconforming. And so I just put a real quick note on the grandfathering. We do have it, and I apologize if you can't read it. Maybe I'll zoom in here. Chapter 23, sub 18 of our zoning ordinance outlines how you can lose your grandfathered status. And essentially the simplest way to identify ways to lose it would be if you have a student rental, and let's say a pandemic happens, and you can't fill that student rental for 12 months plus 1 day, you lose that grandfathered status. But if you're able to rent that student rental to no more than two unrelated individuals within that 12-month period, you can retain that status. So one of the things that we had ran into when the pandemic first hit was can we rent a student rental to a single family unit, and then after 12 months convert it back to a student rental? Under our code, the answer would have been no, that it would lose that grandfathered status. So it's more than just renting it to a family. You would have to rent it to more or less 3 unrelated individuals during that 12 months. And if you don't rent it to those individuals, you would lose that grandfathered status. Once you lose grandfathered status, you can't get it back. Essentially, that's how the grandfathering clause within our code is designed to function. So we've heard a few different concerns over the city's definition of family that have come up not only at this meeting, but also at like the Central Wisconsin Apartment Association meetings as well. But it essentially doesn't allow for like an unmarried couple who may purchase a home and have a roommate, which is becoming more commonplace as delays in marriage and the housing market changes to occur. There's no exemption for live-in assistance for those with disabilities. There are people, especially in the core of the community, that really like this definition because it's been a good policy to prevent expansion of boarding houses within the city of Stevens Point. And then it presents challenges on how to deal with, let's say, for an example, 2 single parents with their dependents who decide that they're going to live in the same housing unit as a way to save money, as an example. So, as we go through, we create these policy recommendations. First off, it is commonplace for a municipality to define family within their zoning code. I would have a really hard time taking the laissez-faire approach to this whole concept and just get rid of it in its whole entirety. I think having some definition is good for the community. I would recommend that we kind of keep some definition, but work through it. We have to be aware that we live in a university community, and especially be cognizant about the owner-occupied properties around the university. We don't want to further prevent, opportunities for owner-occupied housing around the university, conversion of those boarding houses back to single-family owner occupancy. Our zoning code should be updated to reflect the changing economic and social conditions of our community. We don't want to encourage more boarding houses through recommended policy changes. It defeats the purpose, really, I think, to the Housing Task Force. And finally, zoning is hard enough to understand. You can study it for 3 years. Land use policy is really challenging and complicated, so that the recommended policy should be easy to understand at the end of the day, that somebody could dive into chapter 23, go to the definition of family and say, yes, I fall within this, or no, I don't fall within this. So we put together 2 policy alternatives. We're not saying that we should go with either one of these, but let's kind of use these as a base for a conversation. I'll go over both of them, and then feel free to chime in as we get through this. But One of the alternatives that the city could increase from no more than 2 unrelated individuals to 3 unrelated individuals, and then provide explicit exemption for living caregivers. And this is what a possible amendment could look like. Anything in red would be added to the family definition as it currently exists. So remember, we mentioned, our current code says, or such individual or person plus 1 individual not having such similar legal relationship. In this instance, we just change 1 to 2, and then we'd add the living caregiver for those with disabilities as defined in the Americans with Disabilities Act would not count against the total number of unrelated individuals. This was a policy alternative that's been talked about quite a bit. And in fact, I think the Central Wisconsin Apartment Association kind of brought this up as a reasonable compromise, going from 2 to 3 unrelated individuals. But I don't know if the committee or the task force has any comments, questions, or concerns about this possible policy alternative.
I'm wondering how when enforcing this at the current time, like the definition of a single housekeeping entity functioning as that, because like if there are 3 unrelated people but they have a single bank account that they like purchase house things from, like food, and but they're just unrelated friends after post college living together, I feel like that is exactly what you're talking about is becoming more common, all the way to like the formality of like, do they need to organize as a housing co-op in order to live together and be able, I guess I often grow frustrated with the kind of distinction between like owner occupancy and being family, because there are many families that rent and there are families that own, and so it's a difference between like owner occupied and rental versus like family units, and not, because I think from I'm sure your experience and what we can see across the community, like one person who owns a house can allow a house to go into a state of disrepair just as like much as a few people, and similar, like in contrast, 8 couples or like 4 couples living together might take care of a house more more proficiently than that single person, but they might be 4 couples living together and renting. And so it's kind of a question of what exactly are we trying to prevent from happening here, I think is the question.
Well, and I've got about 1 million notes. I could go on this for an hour. Some back history. I have been saying this for probably 15 years. And for the last 12 have just been told that I'm just a landlord trying to make more money. But it truly, the city of Stevens Point's definition of housing is and has been hurting the city for years. It's forcing students onto campus. It's not allowing the density in the outside neighborhoods. I think everyone tends to focus on the campus core and complain about the number of students there, but that's where our current zoning forces them to go. Mm-hmm. Eliminating, or even going to 3 or 4 would allow that to decompress that area. I understand the concern for keeping an eye on those neighborhoods and making sure that we don't have the opposite effect where people go in and buy more homes and convert them, but I don't think the current housing market really makes sense in doing that, because those home values have gone up so much. They don't make sense as rentals anymore. Now, maybe an owner-occupied rental is a different story, but we'll get to that. I think on the next slide I had some more thoughts on that. But the current zoning actually forces us to discriminate, because if I have a family that wants to rent an empty student rental I have right now, I almost have to turn them down for fear of losing my grandfathering, and it puts landlords in a very difficult position. If I have a 4-bedroom home and I have 2 families or two unmarried couples say they want to rent this house together, I have to deny them, or not in that situation, it could be before, but we have oftentimes where a group of 3 wants to, I'm like, I can't rent to you, or if a family wants to rent a single family home that we have empty, I can't rent to them because I will lose my grandfathering. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of concerns that come into play beyond what was just managed or just mentioned. I think even the large student housing, the demand for that is waning. You're not seeing nearly as many people that want the 7-8 person houses anymore. I think if the city if we at some point go to 3 or 4 unrelated, you're going to see again a decompression in that campus neighborhood, and students actually able to get the housing that they want In addition to all the housing being built around campus is gonna continue to kind of decompress that. And I think we talked a little bit about some of the grant programs available for conversion of those units. Ryan and I talked beforehand about maybe upping some of those values based off of, as a percentage of the value of the property, not necessarily just a set amount, so that you're targeting some of these larger properties. But I think there's kind of a multi-pronged approach to some of this to prevent, further conversion of existing properties around the campus core, but also not limiting the properties that are currently rentals around the campus core. Even if you have if you have a fire right now and lose a property, I can't put back a multifamily property there. Now I'm stuck because of the current zoning going to a single family home. There's a lot of things that come into play with all of that. I don't know that I have any. I think the live-in with disabilities is a good idea. I would consider going to 4 unrelated instead of 3. Again, you can oftentimes get 2 unmarried couples that want to live together, and even if we go to 3, that still wouldn't be allowed.
Yeah, and one scenario for individual with caregivers, a scenario that's in place here. But another one, particularly because of the cost of caregivers, is let's say 3 or 4 IDP individuals and 1 caregiver. The one-to-one situation, the amount of neglect and abuse in IDP communities is huge, and isolation is one of the reasons for that. But if you could have a scenario for the IDP community where they could have 3 to 4 individuals, 1 caregiver there, that would help that.
I think in the policy kind of proposed on screen, it would be, you could do 3 IDD individuals with 1 caregiver or 2 caregivers, because those caregivers wouldn't count against the total number of individuals in the property.
Yeah. Okay, so you could do 3 to 1, but not 4.
Yep.
Is there an exception to this when it comes to like any kind of transition housing, whether it's, addiction issues, correctional issues?
Yeah, so yes and no. We kind of treat it as temporary housing, and when it's treated as temporary housing, typically less than 30 days, we don't necessarily enforce the definition of family in those specific instances. I think like the Oxford houses that we have in the community, where you have maybe 2 or 3, maybe 4 tenants, they typically will go through some type of conditional use permit as part of their approval process, and that's where we can at least be made aware that the folks there are in between, various properties or different homes. And so that's where we've allowed it historically in the past. But as it relates to putting it directly in the zoning code, not necessarily. Good question.
Well, I would, as somebody who is working with the incoming refugees coming to Stevens Point, the point that you just made, right? Like there's a whole lot of housing then that we can't even begin to look at for rentals because
For fear of
the
losing
landlord
that.
could lose
Yeah.
their
And that's
grandfathering.
one of my fears, and I know it's on the next slide, but exempting a radius around the campus, I think that's one of my biggest concerns with that. If there's a way to address limiting conversion of new properties, but allowing 3 or 4 unrelated and existing rental, continuing that grandfathering so that we don't have those concerns.
So I'm gonna say something that's probably not at all like, I don't know, logistical or, it just makes me really uncomfortable defining family. It just makes me really uncomfortable. I understand the need for it in the housing thing, but I think it's presumptive. I think the idea that is presumptive that people who aren't married to each other are not family.
Mm-hmm.
So I just really have a really
Well,
big issue with that.
That's
And
where
a
you
lot-
say
I
like
wish we could
housekeeping
have a different
units,
way
yeah.
of even a word to go in that, because frankly, not just that they're getting married later, less people are getting married.
Yeah.
Well, and there are different municipalities use square footage of living space.
Yeah.
Do you have a percentage of how many have like a defined number versus how many use just a base square footage of living space?
But there's not that there are some that will use square footage as a basis for that, and in fact our property maintenance code and occupancy code does have at least the minimum square footage requirements for a bedroom and a kitchen, and there's something else in the Universal Dwelling Code as well. There are, like, City of Wausau has this functional family definition where, you either are a family unit or a functional family unit. And I mean, you probably have a page and a half of their City of Wausau's definition. And I don't think we're opposed to looking at it. I think where we, as staff, struggle is, first off, we never ask for someone's, like, birth certificate or how are you legally related. The enforcement and having some type of simplicity goes a long way in our ability to, encourage people to live within that functional family unit. But if that's something that the task force wants us to look more into, is bring a square footage recommendation or like a functional family definition back as part of it. I don't think we're opposed to it by any means. I tend to stray away from the square footage component because you'd be taking the grandfathering for a lot of these larger homes out of the question. I mean, if you have a 4,500 square foot home that's been used as a boarding house, our long-term objectives in the city has been to convert those back to some type of owner occupancy. So if you have a square footage, are you actually achieving that goal of trying to convert some of these back to some type of owner occupancy?
But why is that the goal?
Because there's a lot of conversation that revolves around the ability for neighborhood stability, especially in the core of the community. When you convert some of these boarding houses back into some type of owner occupancy, or even like a single family rental, that's been the goal of this community for a number of years. I mean, way before 2015 and before that. I mean, you clearly saw it defined within the 1979 code that there was a problem, and so when they rewrote the zoning code, the folks at the time said, we recognize this is a problem, we want to start correcting this problem. I think we'd be in a really uncomfortable spot if we went back and said, well, it's just based on square footage as opposed to some type of
And I don't
definition of functional
disagree.
family.
My concern is that the goal is to get it back to single family owner occupied. When this task force has identified that density and multiple, why can't the goal be to work towards improving those properties, coming up with programs for owners or new owners of properties to improve those and maintain the use of, instead of, we have a couple that are like 4-4-3. Why not have a program in place where I can get a grant to improve that and drop to like 2-2 and 2? And maintain the multifamily of that component and the density that the city, is probably an increase in tax base, it's an increase in density of people for production of services and stuff. I take issue that the root goal is to go back to single family owner occupied when we've discussed multiple times as a group that isn't always what's best.
I was just gonna ask if you checked if anyone online had their hand raised.
No, but if they raise their hand or they start
Mm-hmm.
speaking, they'll pop up. Mhm.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Noah. And sorry for being late. Had to make enough money to pay the bills. So, I understand what you're saying, and I think we have to figure out what the accompanying goal goes with that and how we build strong neighborhoods. And is it a mix of those things? So single family, because that's going to always be the anchor, right? And then multifamily or rental units for those people who really don't want to get into home. I think it's a mix of those things. I think there's an ancillary goal along with this, or maybe it's an ancillary question. How do we build strong neighborhoods? Because they're the foundation of any community.
And I agree, I feel like it's forever, the city has been they love the university for what it brings to the town, but they also kind of want to turn an eye and say, nope, we don't need housing for these people. For the longest time, the city of Stevens Point has been so anti-student rental. So, the feeling I get is they'd love everyone to live in glorified dorms on the edge of campus, and they don't want the students in those neighborhoods. And I think for the students, that's not what's best. That's a large transition to home ownership as they graduate and get jobs and move out into the world. It's a large transition. I feel like there is a good balance, but I feel like around campus, that balance probably swings a little bit you have to almost look at it in different areas of town where that balance point is going to be. And around campus, I feel like people have tried for years to apply what might happen out, by Buchholz or some of those, in those neighborhoods where that balance point might be. They've tried to apply that to the area around campus. And it's just, I think that, you need to take a look at it and accept the fact that we have a campus there, we have students in the community,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
that balance point is going to be different in that neighborhood than it is in other ones.
Balance. Yeah, I think it comes down to balance. And I don't know that there's necessarily an anti-university, at least not on my part. I have students living around me, and for the most part, I've no issue. Well, except for the one place, because they're noisy. But everybody else they're just like regular neighbors. So that's not an issue. So, but again, I think it's not only deciding what the policy is, but what are these ancillary things and what those look like, in creating the balance of necessary temporary housing. So whether it's college rental or someone's that's just in between things and don't know if they want to get into buying a home, and then also stabilizing our neighborhoods.
Nope, and I agree. When Ryan mentioned the ultimate goal is to convert as many of those rooming houses as possible to single-family owner-occupied homes, that is anti-student, rather than working with and embracing in those neighborhoods and trying to create more opportunity for those students or for anyone, in any non-two unrelated family structure. That I think the goal should be to, maybe take that goal, take a step forward and say, okay, the goal isn't conversion of every one of these properties, or some of these, not everyone, I'm putting words in your mouth, not everyone, but converting these rooming houses to single-family owner-occupied homes. The goal should be converting them to safe, affordable housing that meets the density needs of any given neighborhood.
Well, I think that's part of, it's easy to, Cindy Nabel is a really, really good example of someone who stuck through her neighborhood through the immense change. Mm-hmm. When she purchased her home a number of years ago, there was a really good balance and mix of owner-occupied and student rentals. And I think that we're not saying convert the entire third district into all owner-occupied. I think that's an unachievable goal, right? But can you get that mix back to maybe 50-50 or 60-40, as opposed to 20 or 25% owner-occupied and the remaining percentage student-occupied? Because there is some merit in a lot of Cindy's concerns that there is no neighborhood stability when every 9 months you're turning over students.
But that comes with living around a campus, though. 50-50 is the average for all of Stevens Point. So why apply that to an area where notably around campus you have more students? That's where, again, I feel like it should, whether it's 60-40, 75, like there should be a different metric for that area around campus. Stevens Point is a town with higher rental rates, and applying that same percentage to the campus, I don't feel like is a fair metric.
Yeah, I think part of when the code was changed, I think there is also some merit in the fact that even some of our older neighborhoods that aren't around campus are not. There are some student rentals, let's say on the north side in District 4, where you have a few student rentals. But some of those homes are family occupied rentals. That we have a good mix of owner occupied rentals on the north side. I think that's where you saw the definition of family being utilized and leveraged, and really working towards retaining the neighborhood character there. Even in the Gerke Park neighborhood, we have a lot of single-family post-war development here, and you're starting to see some more rentals pop up throughout these neighborhoods, but they aren't extensive student housing. It's more single-family or occupied, or not single-family occupied, but single-family rental neighborhoods. And so there is some merit in saying that the policy has worked well outside of the core of the city, in districts 4 and 9 and 2 as an example, or even 5, where you get started those more tertiary neighborhoods from the university. But I think we have the policy has not worked in the core, because we now are running into issues that you've mentioned earlier, where you have an opportunity to rent those homes that have historically been student rental boarding houses to, let's say, larger family units, and the landlord isn't able to because they're worried about losing that grandfathered status. So is there a way to retain that policy outside of the core, but within the core maybe have some adjustments? And that was essentially the next policy alternative recommendation. So,
Do you want to show us number 2?
yeah, I can show you number 2. So another alternative, this is actually was partially stolen from Platteville, but where you establish a separate zoning overlay within a quarter-mile, half-mile radius of the university, and then you could retain the no more than 2 unrelated individuals component there, but outside the UWSP radius, you would allow no more than 3 unrelated individuals there. And this is actually the recommended policy from the 2017 housing study. And that is essentially what it would look like. The purple is essentially the university. This is the quarter mile, the yellow, and the red is a half mile. I guess the question would be, do you want to get more restrictive within the radius around the campus, or would you want to get less restrictive? But all things considered, I think outside the radius of the campus, I would recommend that we retain some type of more restrictive policy to prevent conversion, in some of these neighborhoods. But I'm open to suggestions, ideas. And
Would there be a
put
way
something
for
together.
staff to exempt conversion of new properties, but allow the 3 or 4 unrelated to existing properties, so we don't have to worry about the grandfathering around campus?
Probably not. That's just another form of grandfathering, right?
Mm-hmm.
It would be.
So then we're really not, again, we're not gaining what we need to gain around campus, where you're able to rent to
Flexibility.
families. You don't have the flexibility. I understand, and I honestly fully support if there were a way to differentiate between new conversion and allowing the grandfathering for existing. But I don't know that sticking to just 2 unrelated in a core around campus solves anything. I mean, that's,
Many of them are 4-bedroom or more bedrooms than
Yeah.
that, too.
It could also start, it's a policy shift and a force to, okay, so you double down, you keep the 2 unrelated individuals around the university, and then you put more money, there's a program, I'm blanking on the name of the community, where they identify specific neighborhoods where you can get more money from the city to do rental conversions. And maybe that's how you target it.
but then is the city not defining family and rewarding people who meet a typical family definition?
Well, the whether typical family or functional family, that we can definitely explore as part of a possible zoning code change. I think that's what my understanding from as long as I've been with the city, that was the ultimate goal, was to convert either to owner occupied or to single family or maybe 2-family renter occupied, as opposed to keeping the boarding houses.
I don't know that that's something I can get behind.
That has been, though, the underlying policy.
Well, I know, and
of
that's
the
why we
council.
have the housing issue we have today.
Well, it's even as simple as, like, what if 2, as you were saying, 2 unmarried couples is, perhaps they're becoming associate professors, they come to work at campus, they want to live near the university, and they like, maybe for all intensive purposes, they're occupying 2 bedrooms as 2 unmarried couples, but then it's a 4-bedroom house and they want to rent out a room, or even just there, that doesn't really
Well,
fit around campus.
Is Logan gonna come defend me when I get sued for violating a fair housing law by not allowing somebody to rent in a student rental I have on campus because I'll lose my grandfathering?
Well, the short
The
answer is
answer is
no.
no.
But I was trying
You're
to
on
think
your
of,
own there.
well,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
your fear of loss of grandfathering status doesn't. I mean, I don't know how to phrase that. I get where you're coming from with the fear of losing the grandfathered status for some of these boarding houses, but at the same time, like, that's that's been the purpose of the definition of family since 1979 is
That doesn't make
we
it right.
want to convert these boarding houses into some type of other occupancy other than boarding house. You know, if you have a 5 or 6 bedroom house, could you convert it into a duplex and rent to 2 family units?
Not, the city wouldn't let me do it. If I came to you with that proposal right now, I'd get laughed at.
It all depend on zoning.
Yeah, which is all, that whole area was rezoned. It's all, none of it's R4.
Right, it's all single and 2 family.
Yep.
Yep.
So that I wouldn't be able to do what you're proposing. And that's what I'm saying, maybe the goal of going back to these single-family homes and 2 unrelated is not realistic, and it's not what's best for the city. A rental side, I don't think that's, you know, we're looking at density. We've talked about new construction and going with, you know, trying to find a way to put 6 tiny homes on a lot. Why are we all for density and changing family status when it's outside of the campus? But the second we get around campus, it's, oh, no, we have to maintain the status quo. We can't do it. I think it's an all or nothing approach. If we can't exempt just new conversion, I don't buy the argument that we can't go to 3 unrelated or 4 unrelated around campus.
But there's a real, I mean, we have significant issues with stability in District 3. I mean, that is where we have some of the highest calls for police. That's where we have the highest turnover. And I'm not equating it all to the student rentals. I mean, I lived in District 3 as a student, but, you know, if there's a way to bring back some stability in that neighborhood, I think we'd be remiss if we just passed up the opportunity, right? And that's what the definition's been existing for, and to stop the conversion of single-family homes into boarding houses. I think there's a real policy discussion about, you know, why we want the conversion, especially in the core, to some type of either family-occupied or owner-occupied housing there.
What about its adjacency to the historic district? And I think that probably is an overlying.
So non-traditional families can't live in a historic home?
Well, of course they can. I'm just saying, I'm not sure what that interface is.
I don't think there would be.
I think there's still just a problem with the presumptive definition of family.
Yeah,
That's at
I
the
agree.
core of this, right? And no matter how you get around it, there's like, this is a big word that probably doesn't really apply, but a draconian purpose behind it. And I just, I don't know, I don't have the answers. I just, I think we're moving into a time period when what once was, especially when we thought about people living in a home, is not necessarily always going to be the case. Now, is Central Wisconsin going to be slower behind that wheel? Yes.
Yeah.
But still, right, like how often do we come together to figure out zoning to apply to this? Because I hate the idea that people who are figuring out a way to live together that will provide stability aren't afforded the ability to do that because our zoning laws say, no, we don't recognize you as a unit of people who should live together. Like, what?
I've also talked to our representative Shankland about this, and from my understanding, whenever any legal action has been pursued in challenging this definition of family, the person's always won that, like, they're allowed to live like that. So that's where I also come from. Like, I don't know that they're, like, I understand the desire to have some definition to work off of.
Right.
But again, it's like, well, it doesn't actually hold if someone were to actually take the initiative to pursue the challenging of that, like the young person, whoever the person that bought a house and rented it to their 3 roommates, 3
Right.
friends. It's just like, if they had pursued legal action on that, I don't know that would have put the city in a good status.
Well, I just wonder if there's a way to, again, exempt the existing single-family homes from being converted. If you go to 3 unrelated across the board, is there just a different way for staff to find a way to, you know, prevent those from being, you know, even if you go to, you know, okay, so you're gonna go to, you know, it's not like you could buy that house and put 15 kids in it, or buy a big home and put in 3, you know, we're talking 3 people. It's not, you know, if you go to 3 unrelated across the board, I really don't think, again, because home values, say even at $400 a month, a student is $1,200 a month. A 3-bedroom house on campus is worth $180,000 or more. The rents don't cover that payment.
More.
Yeah, or more. So I don't think, years ago when a house was $100,000 on campus, yeah, it made sense for, now with home values, I think we're worried about something that is gonna be a rare occurrence, if at all, on those. And again, I think the way to tackle that is, okay, so you go to 3 and you have a single family house that 3 people move into, they're students, let's combat that by trying to convert more of, come up with more grant programs, come up with other programs to try to get at the existing rooming houses that are kind of the heart of the issue, not these small homes.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do is, and maybe it's a little bit of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, is the real challenge in the rooming houses, and I've got one across the street from me. It's big and pink, and I think everyone knows where it sits on the corner of Wisconsin and Division, is that massive flow of humanity and junk and noise and just disrespectful to the neighborhood, where we have other college rentals that are, the Saturday afternoon, it's nice, they're outside, and by 7 o'clock, they're done, they're good. So I think, are we trying to solve some of those disreputable locations where and I'm assuming they're all college students across the street, making that assumption. Well, I've talked to them, they are. And, I think we're trying to tackle that issue on those big rooming houses and the problems they bring, including, buildings that are in disrepair or entire backyards that are gravel and probably problem students, which is the outlier, because I think in my experience, most students are fine. They're following the rules, and we've got one that's on the corner of Wyatt and Ellis. I mean, the guys new windows and new siding. The students there are always, following the rules. Great landlord. So I think we've got good, which is mostly, and then we've got bad, and we're trying to use the definition of family maybe to somehow.
But the 3 unrelated is not going to stop a big rooming house.
Yeah.
Those exist already.
Yeah.
I think you're better off either throwing money at or coming up with some other ways to continue to deal with those rooming houses. The 3 unrelated around campus, again, is just causing issues with the definition of family. I mean, I keep coming back to that, but you're forcing landlords to say, I can't rent to that person because you're not a traditional family. You're forcing those people from not being able to buy. You're steering them into other neighborhoods. All these things that as a real estate agent I can't do. We can't steer people. We can't, violate. The city's doing that through their zoning right now. And I feel like if you go to 3 unrelated, you need to do it across the board and find other zoning ways to tackle, not converting new existing homes, to non-owner occupied. I don't know how you do that, but the main one, the boarding houses, the student rentals that, you can drive by and pick out the 5 or 6 that exist around campus that are in rough shape. Find a different way to either focus, more money or what it takes at a conversion program to get those properties, maybe not back to single family homes, but, there's a couple that are off the market but available for sale, where if you could come in for 50 cents on the dollar and convert that to a smaller use, not 4, 4, and 3, if you could come in and go to 2, 2, 2 or 2, 2, 1 or something like that, that's going to be your best way to tackle those problems, not continuing to enforce the 2 unrelated in an area around campus.
Yeah, I mean, boarding houses aside, about a year ago, there was a house on the corner of Phillips and Portage, across the street from the NFAC. For a number of years, it was a single family home that was owner occupied. House went up for sale, somebody bought it, and they listed it as a duplex.
Yep.
Because there was a kitchen upstairs, but it had lost its grandfathered status because it was a single family home for a number of years. We get notified of this, we send them a letter. Now they get all worked up with us because they didn't do their research on the property before they purchased it. Those are the types of homes that, personally, I have no issue enforcing the definition of family on because it should be used as a single-family home, because it historically has been used as a single-family home. And if we were to ignore the conversion to a duplex,
But that's
then
a
we
separate
lose
issue.
another property in the core to some type of rental.
You'd still have that with 3 unrelated though, because that's still, you're adding a unit, that would still be you'd still be not within what's allowed use for the
Well, so
property.
the person that
couldn't
bought
add a
it
second
asked us,
unit.
well, what can I do then? We told her, no more than 2 unrelated individuals. And she said in both units, he said, essentially, one in each unit, essentially, because it's a single-family house, it just so happens to have a kitchen upstairs.
And it wasn't really carved out like
But it's just
2
one unit,
apartments.
it's
It
not-
was weird.
It's
Yeah.
just one unit, you
Right.
wouldn't have separate mailing addresses, you wouldn't have.
Right. But what I'm trying to get at is, we utilize this definition to say you can't rent it as a duplex to 4 unrelated individuals. Because within a duplex, you can rent it to essentially 2 in each unit, 4 unrelated individuals. And that's, those are the types of properties that, all the boarding houses aside, because that's a whole nother conversation about conversion, even these smaller 3, 4 bedroom, single family homes in the core that have been converted to a student rental, those are the homes I think we're really targeting to get back to some type of either single family renter occupied, single family owner occupied, as opposed to having 3 or 4 unrelated college students in that specific property. Get those homes
That's
that are.
what tips the balance
Yeah.
towards the 40-60
Exactly,
or.
those low-hanging fruit, if you will, back to that. Push District 3 back to a more equalized or balanced, maybe students to family ratio, and really bring some stability back to that district. And let's be honest, that's a long-term conversation. That's a 20-year conversation. But these are the policies that we have to set if that's our ultimate goal.
But I still struggle with violating people's rights to get to that end.
Yeah, and I'd like to jump in here too, listening to the good discussion, but I tend to agree more with Chair Dalton and Mother Jane that your family is no longer the traditional husband, wife, and 2.5 kids. The definition of family has really evolved over the years, and I find it disheartening that I hear some of this stuff specifically directed at college students. Most people are okay, but the college house is loud, or this is a party house and they're annoying. I assume they're college students. Those things, we shouldn't be using our zoning code to legislate good behavior. That has a whole different set of ordinances that we can enact to enforce good behavior. I don't care, heck, I could have a single family house with me and my wife and 4 kids, and we can be loud and obnoxious if if we're in someone's neighborhood too. So we shouldn't be using the zoning code to legislate good behavior, and singling out college students it's not fair to students. I know they get a bad rap, and some of the houses, they have a tendency to be a little more rambunctious than other ones, but I know single family homes that have similar issues, that are actual family units as defined by our current status. So maybe the thought is taking the word family out of there and just using unrelated, or 3 unrelated people, 4 unrelated people, whatever it happens to be. And then the relationship can be defined by other mechanisms. We have domestic partnerships now, and Polly had talked about a housing co-op that could be an avenue for them to do it. But I think your traditional family definition, as Mother Jane said, is probably a little obsolete.
Is it necessary to define family?
To some extent, I think it's necessary. I'm just trying to think, and I've got the the zoning code blinders on right now, right? So, it's like, okay, if you have a family of 4 that's related by some means, and they're renting a room to an unrelated individual, are they just one housekeeping unit at that point? But then what's preventing 7 hockey players from renting a house as a housekeeping unit?
They do that.
They do.
So I'm just wondering, well, first of all, I just don't think it's the city's job to define family.
I guess that's what I was asking, yeah.
Or the government's job, period, on any level. But I'm wondering but knowing what we're trying to help build is that stability piece. And it is gonna be a balance, right? We are a university town. We are a university town, and those issues are of disruption and noise, and as somebody who used to live downtown, I get it. There were times people were walking through the St. Stephen's playground that I thought they were in my bedroom. They were not in my bedroom. That's morality and ethics, and I just don't think, no matter what we put in place, is going to change that. There are other things that change that. But I'm wondering if we talk about household unit.
Yeah, that's where the
As
housekeeping
opposed to
entity, it seems to
family.
incorporate that.
Yeah.
Right,
Element.
and then we figure out how many folks for that particular space can be within a household unit. And I do also wonder, I mean, when you think about stability, part of what makes something stable is when you have too many people in a space, right? But then, when I think about larger families, right? Are we pricing something then that are we making, if we put that number to a household unit for stability and we're tying that into, like, say, square footage or how much space is in there, are we disenfranchising them from affordable housing?
Sure.
Because it's not gonna make up that space, right? Or like, oh, you just had another baby, sorry, gotta move out, you gotta go somewhere else. You just,
Yeah.
so I get it, it's like this complicated layer of mix of things.
And I will state, I mean, yes, we do have ordinances that address noise and, how complaints, and that's ordinances that are managed through, like, the police department. But land use really addresses all those things, or it's supposed to address those things prior to it becoming a problem. That's
Right.
where you look at things like density and parking and setbacks and green space. And so, as we have this conversation, I mean, that's the real purpose of zoning. It's this nerdy code that we all live under and don't realize how restrictive it can be at times until we have to be faced with it. And as practitioners of zoning, we deal with it all the time. Somebody wants to build a 1,100 square foot garage, and we have to tell them, no, you can't, because it doesn't fit on your property, or that's over the square footage limitations. And so, I mean, outside of the definition of family, zoning is used for addressing a lot of those items so that they don't become problems down
Right.
the road, or that we can prevent those problems from occurring down the road. So,
Well, and I don't, I'm not pushing for the 7 hockey players buying a single family home and moving in. I don't want that allowed, because I don't want to have one of my rentals. I don't want a duplex that has 7 people. The square footage is, if you went, is it 50 square foot per person or 75 and then 50 after that? Typically, you could fit a lot of people in a small home. I don't necessarily want that. But I also don't feel like we should set something that's so restrictive that we are violating people's rights, or, again, defining what family is. I think there's a happy medium, or even if there is, we need to find something that's a happy medium where we're not,
Right.
And again, exempting the campus core. I don't want to be forced to discriminate. I'm just not okay with that.
I think we need to
Whether
be
we're on campus or
clear,
not.
too, that this isn't about or against college students. I don't know how we got.
Because it's a lot of the base of why we're directing where we're directing is to keep
Yeah.
college kids out of that neighborhood. So it is kind of against
Necessarily.
student.
I disagree with that, because I think college students also benefit from stable neighborhoods. And that's why you see, like in my district, which, I mean, I have a lot of students living in my district, and I think it's because it's their neighborhoods, and they want to get away from some of the cluster. So I think there's value and benefit to students wanting to have some level of neighborhood feel. And it's not just students, because honestly, the biggest number of calls in my neighborhood is actually a family.
And I agree with you completely. I just, the message we've gotten over the last 20 years from council and zoning and everything else was, they may not be directly saying it, but it's very anti-student. And I feel like even kind of the base of why we're setting the rules we're setting is student oriented. I mean, that's.
So, but now in defense of zoning, and again, getting at what you're saying, if we can set zoning, and I always give this as an example, Clark County, kind of this black hole in Wisconsin, they didn't want any zoning. We don't want no freaking zoning. And every municipality is like, no, we don't want zoning. We want to do whatever we want with our land. And then the frac sand mines started moving in. Holy smokes, did they want zoning. But they couldn't come back in afterwards and start to apply after the fact zoning when all of these frac sand mines were starting to infringe upon people's properties. So zoning plays an important role of avoiding those problems, which is why we're having this discussion.
Right.
So that we're not violating people's rights. And that maybe we can come up with a unique way of finding how we define how people live together, because my household has not been traditional for many, many years. And then also accommodate the needs of students, because they're not so different from all of us. So I think that's what we're struggling, how these pieces and parts all fit together.
And I'm on board with that 100. I just don't know how we say we're not anti-student and then exempt an area around campus.
Trying to avoid the problems.
Of students.
So, and maybe it's different. No, and it's not just students, because it's not just students who rent. I rent.
But then,
You know, I think there's an assumption that only students rent. A lot of people choose to rent because either they found themselves in a financial situation where they can't own a home, or they're in transition and don't want to. I think we need to sort of dismiss that notion.
it's hard to dismiss it though when we're drawing a circle around them.
So I have two. One thing is, I think the other way I think we should maybe think about this is, we might not solve all the concerns that are at the table, but we can take the next best step, right? And learn from that next best step, right? Because this is always probably, zoning is an ongoing reality and what you need to do, and it's going to change and evolve as our community changes and evolves. So we're looking for the next best step. My second question comes out of, my next thing comes out of ignorance. Are the issues the boarding houses that got grandfathered in, for the most part?
When
we think about instability,
not necessarily the boarding houses. I think just the conversion of historically single-family homes into boarding houses was the biggest issue that we've had, and that's something that we're trying to prevent from expanding or continuing. Hence why the more restrictive definition of family.
To your conversion of new.
So when they get, so if I owned one of those big, those houses that got grandfathered in, and I go to sell it, is that grandfather still apply to the next person who owns it? And there's nothing you can do about that?
No, no, the grandfathering status stays with the property until such time that it's no longer considered grandfathered. There's a court case wherein, I can't remember what city it was in Wisconsin, but they had tried to do that, I think in the 30s, where if the property sold, you lost the grandfathered status, and it was contested. And essentially what it comes down to is you lose the value of the property. And so unless the municipality was willing to make up for the difference in the value of the property through forcing the loss of grandfathered status at the time of sale, and essentially it wasn't, you can't do it that way, unfortunately.
And that's what I think, again, if you were to just set 3 unrelated for the whole city and come in with some different tools to work on converting, again, funds for the grant program to convert based off of assessed value or appraised value, maybe because the assessments aren't always 100%. You know, there's different ways to tackle the problems rather than this blanket, in my eyes, discriminatory stance of not applying it evenly. I think we need to define a family, say, or not define a family, maybe the case is, and say, hey, we're gonna allow different living situations across the board and deal with the problems that presents.
Edu, I see your hand raised, go ahead.
Yeah, so this has come up a couple of times in our housing authority where we try to follow the City of Stevens Point occupancy code, but I know like the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in general, they say for occupancy, they usually say no more than 2 people per bedroom. And it gives obviously they need to be on the lease and on a legal tenant, but it gives flexibility where people don't necessarily have to be related, but they have to, you know, be on the lease, they have to be a legal occupant. And it doesn't take into account square footage as much, but that's just one example if we wanted to look at, is just to see about, you know, no more than 2 people per bedroom and consider that. And that may, sometimes just having a general broad definition may give people the flexibility that they're looking for. So just something to consider.
So I've got just one quick comment, and then I think I've got enough information where we can go back to the drawing board. You know, we assume the best in our landlords, and that they aren't taking these existing single-family homes and further putting them out of compliance with the grandfathered status. When I first came on with the city, we had a landlord that converted a basement into an apartment with no permits, nothing. And it was a student rental that was a single family that they had essentially converted to a duplex. And again, most landlords are going to work to be in compliance, but we still have landlords that very clearly don't follow the rules and regulations of the zoning code. And so, you know, then we were in a situation where we had to physically make them remove the kitchen and the bathroom because they didn't do it with permits, which was an issue that we can always work through, but it was a problem. But most importantly, it was a single family home that they converted to a duplex, and it met none of the underlying zoning requirements. And so now we were playing bad guy because, you know, we have the zoning code that we have to enforce. So, you know, most landlords will work well with the city. There are landlords that will do a lot of things without permits, a lot of things without telling us, and then we find out of these issues essentially through postings, through tenant complaints, that's a classic, and things of that nature. So what I'm gathering from this conversation is the idea that having a boundary around the university is not necessarily favorable to the task force, but something wherein we would look at redefining family, not necessarily calling it family, but maybe housekeeping unit or functional family or however that might be, and being more inclusive of it. But it sounds as though we're more comfortable with going from 2 to 3, essentially unrelated individuals citywide.
Yeah.
Does that kind of sum up the overall
I mean, I
conversation?
would love to see 4, again, just the 2 unmarried couples, but I also don't want to, you know, it's always a give and a take, and I don't want to push too hard, you know, but 3 is a big step in the right direction.
Incremental change, right?
I like what Jane said about household units. I think that in some ways.
And I would be all
that's-
for redefining family as well outside of that 3 unrelated, that, yeah, it's
Yeah.
something very non-discriminatory, yeah.
We will go back to the drawing board and bring something back, hopefully next month, that we can further dive into.
Great.
Seem fair?
More work.
I love it.
Well, the zoning code it's esoteric and it's weird and not too many people. I mean, the fact that we're even having the conversation is really good.
Yeah, I don't think people even think there is one.
Right. Obviously, because as I've been looking at buying a home, I'm finding that many people don't realize some of the requirements for things they are doing without permits. It's a surprising thing.
Okay, well, we're gonna move on to the next goal. I know that you described last week that there's a lot going into this, so perhaps we will not cover it all today, but a good chunk of it.
Yep.
And respecting
Yep.
time of
And
people.
In fact, I really enjoyed the last conversation and was hoping it would take the majority of the time, so. And
That's your wish.
Yeah. I'll go through goal number 2 quickly, but I think clearly in just being cognizant of everybody's time on a really nice Tuesday afternoon that we don't need to dive into these. We can bring this back the next month as well, and just kind of give you an overview. But as we go through these goals, and if I send these out to you in PowerPoint, if you have questions, comments, or concerns, please send them back to me. We do take everything into consideration. So the second goal that we identified was to increase home ownership opportunities through social equity. And I think there's a lot to unpack with that goal in and of itself. So we'll just dive right in. I'll give a quick overview of existing programs that we have, and really focus on the screen because all of the programs that we have require the family size, oh boy, I said the F word, to be, the income of the family size to be consistent with the guidelines that we have through essentially U.S. Census, your gross income for average median income. So that's just, as we have this conversation, if you're a family of 2, the family income maximum would be $45,450. So within our existing programs, we have things like Housing Cost Reduction Initiative. These are loans that provide assistance for down payment assistance, and they also help cover the closing costs of purchase of a home. The biggest thing here is that they do need to secure primary financing. We do have 2.25% interest, and that is due within 30 years or when the homeowner sells or moves out of the home. These are the types of programs that are managed through CAP services. CAP also manages the Home Ownership Opportunity Reserve Account, the HURA, and I know James Barrett talked about that maybe 2 months ago now, and essentially these are just the existing programs that we have, and I think it's an important piece of the conversation. A lot of these are funded through HUD or Community Development Block Grant funding as well. We have, again, Community Development Block Grant Housing Program. Those are more for home improvement loans, loan at moderate income homeowners. So these are property maintenance items, not necessarily property acquisition, but you can use for like a different program within Community Development Block Grant for down payment assistance. So I think what I've learned through doing research is that there's a lot of programs that are out there for down payment assistance that are favorable terms, like they're not due until 30 years is up, or when you sell the home, but getting that primary financing always seems to be probably the biggest challenge, especially A, in this housing market, but B, when you have a maximum income of $45,450.
I'll throw in there, in 15 years and probably 1,000 home sales, I've had one buyer work with some sort of a HUD down payment. Like the income restrictions just don't mesh with what they need to purchase a home.
Well, yeah, I mean, $150,000 home and you're making 45 grand. Yeah.
The Home Housing Repair and Home Buyer Program, same. Again, it's designed to make home improvements and also be utilized for some type of down payment assistance. Again, a lot of programs for down payment assistance. They are complicated. They do require a lot of paperwork, some housing counseling, and in a market like this, it's really hard to go through that process, go through an acquisition and sale, and be able to utilize programs like this.
I guess my question to Noah is, are those offers even considered?
It's not
today?
that they're not considered, it's just the buyers that qualify for those programs rarely are gonna qualify for a mortgage or be in a position to take out a mortgage for.
But as the seller and you're looking at what could be a good offer,
Yeah, I mean,
but
today,
you're gonna
no.
add all these contingencies.
Yeah, today you'd miss out instantly.
Right, I guess that's
Yeah,
what I was
yeah.
saying, yeah.
I have a weird question. Is there any way when we think about those houses that have been grandfathered in, to tie them into some kind of program to encourage first-time home buyers to buy those homes and take them out of that grandfather clause place and turn them back into single-person homes?
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. I think the challenge there is, and historically, is the cost. So if you have an income-producing property, those home costs are more expensive as opposed to same house. If it's income-producing, let's say it's 180,000, but if it was the same house in a single family, let's say it was 120,000. These are just numbers I'm pulling out of my head, but that has always been an issue as it relates to acquisition and conversion.
I will state single family values have gone up enough. We have 3 rentals that within the next 2 years I'll be selling just as single family homes because they are worth more as homes now than they are as rentals. So I do, a program like that
The
that would
balance is turning.
incentivize, a seller or a buyer
Right.
to
Turn it
target,
into a single family.
well, and target a certain home buyer audience for those existing homes. Something
Right.
like that could be productive.
Yeah, because I think about, I have a son and a daughter who live in rental housing. He's the only income, right? But in the areas where we have these homes, that'd be perfect for a young family to live in, but they're not gonna, there's nothing.
Yeah.
So as we dive into the specific goals, remember we've kind of have 3 categories: zoning, economic development, community engagement as part of the overall objectives to achieving the goals. Of course, zoning, change the zoning, definition of family continues to be a major player here. We talked about this enough in the last hour and a half. I don't want to get into it any further. But finding ways to allow a change in the definition of family. Also, finding ways to increase density through permitted uses, which Noah brought up, and I thought it was a really good point that we talk about increasing density, but we don't talk about changing definition of family. Touche, Mr. Eschenbach. So. Another one would be work towards finding creative solutions for different styles of housing, things like cooperative housing, community land trust housing, deed restricted housing. Again, zoning makes all of this really difficult, and other than going through like a planned unit development, which requires additional steps, there's really no good way within our current code to identify this. Of course, we talk about rewriting our entire zoning code, and of course this will be part of that overall conversation in a few years when we really dive into that. But expansion of the zoning code to allow for different styles of development or ownership without jumping through extensive hoops. Madison in the last year and a half adopted a cooperative zoning definition, and then I included information on community land trusts through HUD, which has been a really good coordinator of community land trusts and acquisition of like mobile home parks that are in community land trusts, and now the homes are owned and managed by that essentially land trust. Switching over, some economic development changes, need for programs that assist the ALICE, lower to middle class population seeking to own housing, and engage with local companies to assist with workforce development efforts. Housing and workforce go hand in hand a lot of the times. A good example is, anyone know where Cuba City, Wisconsin is? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great little town of about 2,000 people, but if you get a job in Cuba City and you can't find a place to live, why would you relocate to Cuba City? I use that example because I know the economic development guy there a little bit, and I always give him crap about Cuba City, Wisconsin. There are a lot of programs, as we just talked about, that exist for low-income individuals, but for those who are just outside of that perspective, it becomes really a lot more challenging. And because those are tied into federal monies, it becomes even more challenging. And so, is there a way for us to identify new programs, who are those who are above the maximum income threshold, but still struggling to find or afford their own housing, and then reduce the red tape required for getting those funds in their pockets for down payment assistance. as an example. So that would be the recommendation. Sullivan Oshkosh has a really good program that's really identifies this and is something that they've utilized the affordable housing extension in their TIF districts for feeding that program. And I always talk about Live It Up Wausau. I think it's a great partnership between the city and their private companies where they make donations to the fund itself, and then those donations are utilized to, and then their HR departments say things like, hey, go to the city, get this down payment assistance. I think it's up to $10,000, and it's a grant. We have, through charitable donation, funded that program. We want our employees to use it.
The fund is managed by the city, or is it a separate 501c3?
It's managed by the city.
Okay.
Yeah.
And are the donations charitable donations for those businesses that donate?
Correct, yep.
Nifty.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think one thought I have there is like using different metrics that the city could be more creative with, that outside of like HUD requirements. Like most moderate to low income people don't miss rent payments, but that's not a metric that's necessarily in your credit score, is whether or not you've missed a rent payment, you know, and most people are able to, you know, whether they have a stable or kind of unstable employment, they are still making ends meet to pay for their housing. And that seems like something, it's a difficult metric to measure and follow through on, but maybe Airbnb will come up with a rental website that can measure that for us.
And I always find it interesting that renters can afford $1,200 a month, but it doesn't get fed back to their credit score, so they seem like they,
Yeah.
So if they can afford that, why couldn't they afford a mortgage?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think this is brought up during the definition of family as well, the need for updated programs to encourage conversion near the core from student rental to owner occupied. Again, I don't want to get in the weeds on that one again, and I regret putting that in this PowerPoint now. But also providing new redevelopment plans to acquire, raise, redevelop portions of the core in older neighborhoods that are beyond their useful lives. I think, you know, if you walk down a lot of our streets, whether it be in the core or on the Seasonor side, there are clearly homes that are tired, that are beyond their useful lives, that don't function as well as they once did, that should be considered for acquisition, demolition, and conversion to a new home on that property. We have an existing program, but it's not been utilized in a number of years. Recommendation would be to engage stakeholders, i.e. the owners of those properties, a number of them are landlords, work towards a redevelopment plan and implement updated programs to encourage conversion in the core and older neighborhoods within the city. And I just threw on there, we already have the housing conversion grant, but one thing Redevelopment Authority has not done is create like a redevelopment plan, which they have within their state statutes.
One thing I'd add to consider, and I just had taken some notes on this before I even saw that was you got your bullet points down there, some sort of a grant program either for existing owners or new owners, like we talked about, kind of for downsizing some of these older rooming houses. You know, not necessarily a conversion to an owner occupied, but a grant or low interest loan for somebody to go in and buy, you know, something that say is currently like a 6 and a 5 or a 4, a 4 and a 3 with a basement apartment, and convert it to just like a normal duplex or a, you know,
I see.
2 and a 1 or a 2 and a 3.
Sure.
You know, adding in some sort of a grant program for new or existing owners to take advantage of, you know, because the market's changing. So say 10 years ago I bought a big old student rental that had 15 kids in it. Well, now they don't want to live in a group of 7 or a group of 8, but I also can't afford, I paid $400,000 for that building, it's not worth that. You know, so to have a grant program or low interest to go in and renovate and kind of change that without losing, you know, without having to sell it as a single family home because it's just not feasible, you know, that owner is almost forced to just sit there and continue to run it and can't afford to fix it up. Whether it's, you know, not saying that's right, but they're sometimes those people are just stuck in a tough position where they no longer have the income they had from this property they paid a premium for, and then the market changed on them. That, you know, some sort of a conversion program for those properties, and it wouldn't have to be a carte blanche thing. I mean, it could really be just like, you know, in the historic district, we go in and apply for a matching funds grant, you know, something like that where an owner or someone considering purchasing a property would have to apply for a grant or a low income or a low interest loan or something like that for converting those existing properties, but still maintaining their multifamily, something like that might be a good way to approach some of those buildings.
I think that's a reasonable idea.
Yeah, we can definitely look into that, and maybe that would be one of the ideas that comes out of this goal, essentially. Continued demand for new housing at Stevens Point needs to be addressed. Obviously, within the current market, we've done a not so great job of providing new single or zero lot line development. I thought the Origin folks, their hermit crabbing effect was probably the best definition I've ever heard. We always have talked about trickle-down housing and how that has its own negative connotations, so I like the hermit crabbing effect. We've had minimal new single or two-family development in the last several years. There's a lot of reason for that, mainly because the Village of Plover was giving developers money to do single-family development down in the Tree Acres area, where the Tree Acres Golf Course was. That's all essentially dried up, so I would expect to see some slowdown in terms of new construction there in the next few years.
For them, or was it was? Okay.
Yeah, it was established when if anyone remembers, when the water ski
Yes.
debacle occurred. And that TIF was underwater, and so the village was incentivizing single-family housing at that time.
It wasn't underwater, that's why it didn't. Sorry.
I don't know if putting a pond in sand country is a good idea anyway, but
Yeah, they were gonna line it with like geomembrane landfill liner, sorry.
Interesting.
Off course.
But the city also needs to start filling gaps in various parts of the community, and the city can play developer as needed to coordinate housing development. Not wherein we would be the ones building housing, but we would be the subdividers of land. Mm-hmm. We would put the utilities in, we would take on that cost.
Random question, I was looking at maps the other day. The amount of land that the municipal buildings sit on by Buchholz is
Yes.
almost 50 acres.
Yes.
If you were to put in 0.2 or 0.25 acre lots, the value of that, I don't know how much it would cost to relocate that and build a new building, but it might be something to look into. The amount of land sitting unused on the river there blows my mind. And there's got to be a better use for it than.
It's about 40 million
Yeah,
to build a new
we already
public works
are
garage.
looking at it. Yes, absolutely. It's some of the most valuable property in Stevens Point, and we had a salt garage on it.
Yeah, okay.
It's a really nice salt garage.
It's a really nice salt garage. But yeah,
Cadillac
we've
of
already
salt garage.
done some strategic evaluation of it, got an estimate of, what it would take to build a new public works facility campus.
Yep.
And then there were a number of locations that were recommended, but I completely agree, we need to, that's really, really valuable.
Yep.
Yeah, and I don't.
And I want to chime in here too, because yes, we've been looking at moving the streets garage. However, the words of redevelopment of that highly valuable land into something other than a park is not on the table for me. So others may feel that way, but I will fight tooth and nail any development of our park system.
We're not talking park. We're talking public works department land.
That's in the park.
Still talking well, never mind.
You want to redevelop the park, you go ahead and push it. I'm not going to fight. I will fight, again, tooth and nail for any development on our riverfront. Our park system is one of the best in, as far as I'm concerned, the entire state, and it should not be up for redevelopment.
Not the last word.
Okay, so here are a couple ideas that are not on the waterfront, but just some that exist within the city's existing boundaries. This is a 7-acre parcel, as an example, off of Jordan Lane on the east side. This is a weird town of Hall area where they're kind of scattered site south of Stanley Street. Could be a really nice redevelopment opportunity for the city to do a smaller subdivision in here in an already established neighborhood. Another example would be this area, which isn't too far from that last example, but we've got 44 acres of land adjacent to I-39 in an established, just north of an established neighborhood that could be utilized for some type of housing development as well.
There's a lot of land also on the north side where they would have been through streets and aren't. You know, I know there's a lot of lots up there also that could potentially be developed.
Not a swamp.
Yeah, well, that's the whole north side.
Bring in Phil, you're fine.
Yeah.
So as it relates to community engagement, many of the public has little or no idea that these programs exist. Government's awful at communication. I've said that a number of times. We'll continue to say it because we're just really bad at it. City programs, whether they're managed by the city or CAP services, are underutilized. And one way that we could encourage them is to have informational videos, to work with mortgage officers directly and encourage them to, find if they have a client who's looking who doesn't necessarily have that 20% down. Hey, here's a program that you can pursue with the city or CAP services. The mortgage officers I've worked with in the past on my own properties have no idea that these types of programs exist, or they know that they exist, but they have no idea who to turn to turn someone on to the programs that already have. So if you haven't seen this Stevens Point Police Department's Click It or Ticket campaign video that just went live last week, it's pretty entertaining, and it was very well done by our community media department. So shout out to John and Sarah for putting that together. Those types of videos I think would go a long way in addressing some of the community engagement components. So.
The other thing about that idea about identifying mortgage officers and local banks for people who are coming to, hoping to buy and have been on the edge of that as a financial possibility, the easier we can make it for them, the more streamlined we can make it for them, the more doable it seems. If they have to go out on their own and find all the answers, it's an overwhelming prospect, especially when for a lot of these programs that exist, there's still going to be the gap of there's not actually any housing that will fit the bill. So
There's that
we
too.
can put all
Yeah.
of those pieces together, and then there's nothing for them to buy, or there's two, and then their bid has to be accepted. So
Well, and maybe incentivizing, for owners, I don't know that I actually like this idea, but if you were to give, if the city incentivizes that, hey, if you work with somebody who's using one of our grant programs to purchase a property, we'll give the seller an extra $5,000 or $10,000, or so, incentivizing the seller to consider an offer from somebody who may have been overlooked previously.
That's not a bad idea, because the sellers are looking at the easiest way out, and if they've
Right.
got some, yeah.
there's a
Yep.
problem on both ends, yep.
Yep.
I think a lot of times the fear is those programs of, sometimes they're more restrictive, they have different, the appraisals process is a little more difficult. They're looking for, defects in the appraisal process. The home inspections are a little more stringent, sometimes they're, CAP has to verify. So even the city guaranteeing, maybe not even incentivizing, I don't like the idea of just giving money to sellers, but saying, hey, if something comes up during the inspection process, we'll provide up to a $5,000 or $10,000 grant to the buyer to remedy those things. Something like that, where it takes some of the concern off the seller's mind of, well, what happens if I accept this offer that has more stringent restrictions on it?
More strings on it.
The city maybe
I think
offering
home
to
would
step in.
probably have to at least have minimal qualifications to.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Some sort of set of criteria instead of just willy-nilly, but
Yeah.
no, I agree.
Yeah. So that's all we have for goal 2. I think we even got more information on this than I was expecting. And a lot of it is just taking the information, putting it, and trying to find ways to say, okay, this is a program that we're interested in. How could it function? And we'll bring this back again next month, probably along with the updated definition of family. And so I think that's all we have. One thing I will state is that we have started to put together a website for the Housing Task Force instead of having a physical copy of the task force's recommendations. It's all going to be on a website. mainly because I'm tired of having a bunch of paper in my office, but because it's going to be more accessible to the public if it's a specific website. So we do have a domain. I think it's Stevens Point Housing Taskforce or something.com that will launch
Nice.
in the coming months. So.
Well, and thank you for sending these out ahead of time. It was helpful for me
Good.
as somebody who's kind of ignorant.
I would
Government
never
can be
use
good.
those two words together to describe you, ever.
Thank you, everyone, for your time today.
Thank you.
And with that, I think we can adjourn.
Ooh,
Cool.
Thank you.
Good discussion.
A video of this meeting is available for viewing on the city's website, stevenspoint.com/videos.